Welcome to the Sheep Producers Australia webinar series. Today we're talking sheep and lamb levies with CEO from Sheep Producers Australia, Stephen Crisp.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everyone for joining us. Levies has been a point of consternation, I suppose, for the industry for a long time in terms of people knowing exactly what their levies are, what they're meant for, and who utilises them. So I'll just go through the very basics of what the lamb levy is, because I think there's been a lot of conjecture and misconceptions in the market about what you're actually paying for. So the lamb levy was set literally decades ago. And if you look at the value of the lamb that is set in the levy structure, you can see how that is quite dated. So if a lamb is valued at less than $5, you don't pay a levy. If it's between $5 and $75, you pay 2%. Obviously, there's not a lot of lambs these days going below $75. I appreciate there may be a few, but with the cap set at $75 and 2% of that value being $1.50, that means that the vast majority, in fact, nearly all lambs being sold, you are paying $1.50 per lamb. The sheep levy is something similar. If it's less than $5, you don't pay a levy. If it's between $5 and $10, it's 2%, same as the lamb levy. And if it's above $10, then you are literally capped out at 20 cents per sheep. With the way the sheep have been valued over the past 10 years, and you're seeing first cost ewes up to even $400, but obviously ewes regularly going between $85, $150, $200, depending on obviously age. What stage of the cycle they are, whether they're going to the abattoir or they're going for restocking. But 20 cents a sheep is what you are paying for right now. So if you talk in terms of total numbers, these numbers also are a little bit dated. These are from a few years ago. The numbers are actually quite a lot less in total levies being collected at the moment because the sheep flock has dropped. And there's not a lot of sheep being sold at the current moment while the flock rebuild is going on. So the sheep numbers are well below what these figures would suggest. However, these give you a ballpark figure of how much levy has actually been collected. These are actually 2016-17 figures. So if you look at that, you're looking at about $43 million. But you can see the discrepancy between the lamb collection and obviously a lot of lambs are sold every year. A lot of lambs are sold for meat production for that specific purpose. So you're getting a lot of total numbers will be higher, but the sheep numbers with the 20 cents levy, you get the idea of, obviously that's not a massive contribution, but still an important contribution to the levy total. Current levies would be closer to the low $30 million while we're going through this flock rebuild stage. So where do your levies actually go? What I wanted to go through today was more about people have a lot of misconceptions about where their levy is actually directed to immediately and where they end up and what they're used for. So I just wanted to clear that up as best we could as sheep producers. So for every $1 collected, this is a pretty simple diagram. 8 cents of that goes to Animal Health Australia. With obviously an admin costs, there is a cost in collecting it and distributing the funds, which pretty much averages out, as you can see at the bottom of the table, 8 to 10% of all your levy that's collected actually is involved in the administration of that. We try to make that as efficient as possible. If you look at all the other levies that are collected across the ag industries, that's actually not that bad, although you may argue that any administration cost, no matter how high it is not a good thing. So 8% of that will go to Animal Health Australia, and I'll go through exactly, I'll give you most of the examples of what Animal Health Australia uses those levies for, as well as MLA and the National Residue Survey. Meat and Livestock Australia get the vast bulk of the levy. I don't think that's unexpected. They're definitely the most high profile, and they do all the marketing and R&D functions for industry. And you've got the National Residue Survey, which is actually part of the Department of Agriculture and Water and Environment. And I think it's probably fairly obvious what that National Residue Survey does. They do the surveillance of the throughout the abattoirs, the meat products, and measure for residue of chemicals, hormones, to make sure that we are not exceeding our maximum residue limits in all our trading markets. So where does that money go? What does it actually mean as far as proportion of spend on different sections of what you would expect your levies to be spent on? So AHA handles the biosecurity, and you can see 9% of that goes into biosecurity. Obviously, there's some parts of MLA's funding also goes into biosecurity. So this is pretty much combining the levy funds and giving you a summary of where it actually ends up. Sheep is a lot smaller amount than lambs, so you would expect some discrepancies in the amount that is spent in different areas, simply because lambs give a far greater proportion of the total amount of funds spent. Marketing, lambs are a lot higher in the marketing, but lambs are also the flagship product of the sheep meat industry, and where most of the premium is gained. So obviously you have the most obvious one in Australia being the Australia Day Summer Lamb Campaign, which comes out every year. But there's also massive amounts of marketing in other markets, which we'll go through shortly. The research and development also handled in the vast majority of cases by MLA, but some through AHA. And a lot of that is around the productivity, the reproduction of lambs. And so you would see a high proportion coming in for the sheep side than the lambs. And you can see the residue testing, which is a relatively small amount. The amount actually spent on residue testing is probably not a lot different between sheep and lamb, but because there's a vast total is a lot more for the lamb, and spending as a whole, it comes through as a much lower percentage for lambs in this figure. Pardon me. But this is just to give you an idea of the of where your money actually goes. So just to give you a few examples, Meat and Livestock Australia, as I said, is the vast majority of the levy funds where they go. So they use it for the lamb advertising in the domestic markets. But also you have that True Aussie brand, which is an international brand. They have in-country representatives in most of our major markets. So USA, vitally important, in the Middle East, China, they will have in-country representatives. They're actually very handy in terms of when things go wrong with the trade, having those people on the ground to fix issues and getting involved with government officials. I mean, we have a government-to-government relationship in most instances, and that solves most issues, but it is also good to have your own marketing people on the ground with those relationships to not only help with trade shows and advancing your product, but also in solving problems where you already have market access. So the market access itself, that's obviously in conjunction with exporters. Exporters develop their own brands and have their own marketing teams, and they do a lot in market development and actually gaining access to markets. So we shouldn't lose sight of the role that the processors and exporters play in that role. Peak bodies have a lot to do with government-to-government relationships, but also in opening markets and setting up protocols, making sure that producers are able to do what is expected of them to obtain and retain market access. And quite frankly, it's the reason why lamb is worth what it is today. A carcass can be split up into, well, probably 30 or 40 countries on a regular basis, but up to 60 countries wouldn't be unheard of. Offal can go to different countries, and it's having the highest value possible for each section, each cut of meat, no matter how you split up the carcass. It gives you that total value. Obviously, the fewer markets you have, the fewer ways you can split it into gaining that highest value. That will bring down the value of that carcass in a marked way. So if you have some plants which don't have access to certain markets, they are not able to pay the premium that other plants are able to pay for your lamb. Consumer insights is also done with Meat and Livestock Australia, and that's pretty much getting to know what the consumer is thinking about on all the issues. So it's can be environmental, can be animal health and welfare, but also where they rate us against our competition, which can be the direct competition in terms of red meat, or also the alternative proteins and the flexitarian markets is one of the current buzzwords, I suppose, of consumer insights, and gaining the insight into how much is of that is real, how much of that is noise, what's really affecting the amount that consumers are consuming of lamb and their perception of our product. There's also the global marketing campaigns. They have co-marketing programs where they will assist exporters in developing their brand into a new market. They might team up with Austrade on some of those markets, but most of it would be driven through the levies and through MLA's structure. On the research and development and adoption side, it's important to note that the levy funds are matched by federal government funding in this area. The gross value of sheep and lamb is assessed by the federal government every year, and that will determine how much they are willing to co-contribute towards research and development. So the amount of money that is spent on R&D by MLA will be matched by federal government dollars. So it's actually leveraging your levy spend. Most of the major areas on-farm productivity, so it's like it says there, feed-based management practices. They have producer demonstration sites where they actually test the results of the R&D in the different regions, set it up. Does it actually work in all the different regions? Because obviously we have different climates, different soils, a whole massive number of variation between Western Australia, the East Coast, Tasmania, Queensland, and how that actually operates. They have a genetics program, not surprisingly, testing all the different genetics and traits. You'll see the Australian sheep breeding values and how all that is administered, and the access that producers have. It was all run through these types of programs. Most recently, they set up the Sheep Reproduction Partnership, which is all about weaning rates and how we get them as high as possible. Obviously, that goes right through conception, as well as making sure the conditions are right for the lambs to survive and thrive once they've been born. Animal Health Australia, so you saw that 8% in the earlier graph. What do they do with that money? The Emergency Animal Disease Response, or which is an agreement, so that's why it's called EADRA, if you're into this part of the industry. That's probably one of the most important roles that they play, and beneath that sits the AusVet plan. So it's basically ready. It's all about readiness for Australia if there is a major disease coming into this country. Foot and mouth disease is the one that is obvious, but if you can talk about scrapie and probably quite a few other diseases which we must make sure that we are ready for. And the AusVet plan is having all those diseases which we think are a threat. How would we manage that should they enter the country? Obviously, we have border controls, and we want to stop everything coming into the country, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be ready for it just in case it does. We have the National Sheep Health Monitoring Program. It's one of our biggest spends, and one of the ones that we need to increase the utilisation on, which is actually a surveillance program within abattoirs, where they record, monitor all the different types of diseases that are coming through that abattoir, and able to see if there's spikes in certain types of diseases. So it's all those internal pests, worms, liver fluke. So not just parasites, but any other conditions, especially in the lungs, like a pleurisy, pneumonia type diseases. And one of the biggest areas that they control is also the surveillance programs. These are vital, especially probably one of the most obvious would be the blue tongue program, where they monitor the progress of that around the country. So you've got zones which are free of blue tongue and zones which aren't, and so you are able to source product from zones which are considered free of that particular disease. They also have run programs and still run programs such as Sheep Map, which is the Yoni's disease management system, and the rest of the programs there, I think most of them are airborne diseases, but anyway, that gives you a rough idea of where Animal Health Australia sits in the levy system. National Residue Service, like I said before, they do the testing the meat to ensure minimum residue limits are not exceeded. They investigate and trace any instances of higher residue levels where they occur, and that tracing system is really important. We have to know what the source of any high residue levels is, and so we're able to manage that and we're able to meet our agreements with our trading partners. So we work with the National Residue Service and people such as the APVMA on determining withholding periods, export slaughter intervals, which all producers will be aware of when they are using their products, and they've got that information on the pack of what the chemicals they are using, so they know when they can sell their product. And obviously that agency interacts closely with SafeMeat, which is an industry consultative body, to work out what standards, protocols, where the declarations have to be made to make sure all that happens. Now that's the end of that presentation, but before I go, I should just mention where levies are not utilised. So Sheep Producers Australia does not receive any direct levy stream, and levies are not to be utilised for political lobbying. So Sheep Producers Australia is not a political organisation, but it's actually written in legislation that levies are not allowed or meant to be used for political lobbying purposes. So when you're paying your levy and you think you may be getting a political voice, that is actually not the case. Sheep Producers Australia gets their funding through their memberships, which are with the state farming organisations, and we also have access to the Red Meat Industry Fund, which is a fund set up many years ago, which is distributed through the red meat industries such as Cattle Council, Sheep Producers Australia, the Livestock Feedlot Association. And it should also be noted that the bodies that are set up to represent producers, they're set up through what is called the AMLI Act. So it's the Australian Meat and Livestock Industries Act, and it has the organisations mentioned in that act, which are designed to represent industry on how their funds are spent. They set up the strategy and the policies, which are provided to the service providers, which basically assist them in determining where and how those levy funds are spent. So I hope that gives you an overview. It's a lot of ground to cover in a very short time, but that's just to give you the basics. It's not to go into all the ins and outs and intricacies of where levy funds are spent, where they go. But if you want any more information from Sheep Producers Australia, please do not hesitate to contact us. We'll happily talk about where funds go, why they go there, how it's been set up, and whether there's any possible changes in the future. We can talk about that at any time. Thanks very much.